My name is Dan Lichter. I'm a professor in policy analysis and management. I'm also a demographer and a sociologist. It's a pleasure to be here today. You all have a daunting challenge. Anything related to community and economic development in upstate New York is always tough. And I think what I'm going to show you today, it's maybe even more challenging than you thought from a demographic perspective. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what I call the 4 R's because the 4 D's. There's probably 4 R's somewhere in there too. I'm going to talk about the 4 D's of population change. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to link national trends to the trends that have been observed in New York State, especially upstate New York, over the last few decades. And then I also want to talk about some changes that are occurring within particular labor market areas. So what are these four Ds? So here are the 4 Ds. One is depopulation, which across the United States is a very big trend, and it's become a signature trend over the last decade, I think, especially in rural areas. What's different about New York, though, is it's not only something that characterizes rural areas, but it's also something that characterizes many of the small metropolitan areas of upstate New York, Utica, Syracuse, Rochester, and so on. Deaths, I'm going to talk a little bit about natural decrease, which is in some ways a function of chronic outmigration from New York State, but also from many rural areas and from the cities with residential mobility. I'm going to talk about diversity. Can minorities become an economic and demographic panacea for New York State? And then lastly, I want to talk about deprivation, which is the growing poverty and concentrated poverty and growing spatial inequality, which I think is really characteristic of many parts of New York State, both in rural and in urban parts of the state. So let me start with each of these. Depopulation. I think we're at a point, especially in rural areas across the United States, unprecedented patterns of absolute population decline. And I'll show you a chart here for changes in metropolitan and the non-metropolitan parts of the United States. In the non-metropolitan parts, for the first time ever, we're experiencing absolute population decline. And what's happened here is that over time, those non-metropolitan areas that became successful, either economically, demographically, grew up to be counted as metropolitan and got counted as part of the metropolitan patterns of growth. There's been this successive winnowing over time, which means that the least likely to grow are now in these non-metropolitan areas. And that's a big change from the past. They're less economically vibrant. They have less potential for growth into the future. And I don't think this is going to change anytime soon. When we think about depopulation, we typically think about the heartland, the food, where we produce our food. The red here are those areas that have lost more than 50% of the population. If we look at rural America, about a third of the counties in rural America overall reached their population peak in 1950 or earlier. And of course, since then, there's been a consolidation of agricultural production, the mechanization of agricultural and so on, which has affected not only those farm areas, but also the communities that serve them. This is less true in New York State. You can see there with the green, they've also experienced some depopulation, but not to the same extent as many parts of the heartland. Less than 10% in most cases, that green there that you see. But still, you can see that most of them are not at their population peaks. They're below it and they've lost population. In New York State, you can see that the red here and the light reddish color, the orangish color, all indicate population losses. The majority of counties lost population over the last 8 years, according to the Census Bureau's population estimates. You can see where the growth is. It's in suburban Rochester area, it's in the Buffalo area, but most of that's in the suburbs. You can see it is also downstate in the New York metropolitan region. What's different, again, I think about New York State relative to the heartland is that this also characterizes small manufacturing metropolitan areas. Syracuse, for example, reached their population peak in 1950, just as we've seen in rural areas, and has declined every decade since. This same pattern exists in Rochester. It also exists in Buffalo. We've seen some slight increase, the gentrification that Helena was, I'm not saying that right. Helene, I know I was actually practicing that beforehand. Some slight gentrification, but it's really a drop in the bucket compared to the overall pattern of depopulation. So this is Syracuse. You can see it's declined since 1950, and it's continuing downward. The second D is deaths. We've gone from cradles to caskets or baptisms to funerals. I have a brother who's a priest in the north central part of South Dakota. I asked him how many baptisms does he have and how many funerals did he have last year? And he says, well, I had maybe 40 funerals and maybe 25 baptisms. That's natural decrease. Deaths exceed births. That's contributing to population decline as well. And that is a function of, in the long term, chronic outmigration from many rural areas. The same sort of residential outmigration or suburbanization that we've seen in some of these small metropolitan areas in New York. This is something that's not going to go away anytime soon. My colleague Ken Johnson at the University of New Hampshire shows the proportion of counties in the United States that now have experienced more deaths than births. And we're talking about more than a third of them. And most of those are rural counties. And you can see it's like 1,100 counties have experienced more deaths than births. This is not likely to change anytime soon, especially with an aging population. Here I've got a couple of examples here. This is Onondaga County, and you can see the blue line there are births. The deaths are the red line, and down at the bottom you see natural increase. You can see that that is going down toward zero. But where we really see the real natural decrease is in some of the rural areas. This is Shenango County, for example. Quite a different pattern here where births and deaths are pretty well matched. You can see many periods of time here where we've got a natural decrease, more deaths than births. And that reflects the fact that the people who leave tend to be people of reproductive age, and we've got substantial aging in place. Many populations, these small towns have very old populations that over the next 10 or 20 years is going to experience significant population decline as a result of that. Here's another example of Delaware. I pulled out one here, another rural county, where you can see very substantial levels of natural decrease over time. And again, this reflects the reason I'm somewhat pessimistic about this demographic processes accounting for growth are likely to rebound. If you look into the future, you can see here's Shenango County here. You can see the growth in the projected growth of the elderly population. Those are the numbers there in red, or the bars in red. And then you can see what's happened with regard to children. This is a result of fertility, and you can see declines in those. So we're going to have an aging population, a result of chronic outmigration, and very little likelihood of an increase in fertility, especially as the size of the population of women of reproductive age actually declines. The third D is diversity. I've been looking at whether immigration can be an economic panacea of sorts for declining rural areas. We've seen tremendous change over time in the geographic distribution of minority populations, including immigrants. This is a chart that the Census Bureau put out on the basis of the results of the 2010 decennial census. The darkest blue here are those counties that are majority minority. They have a majority of the population something other than non-Hispanic whites. The next shade is populations that are 36 to 49% minority. And you can see the South is relatively more diverse, primarily because of its Afro-American population and its Hispanic population in the desert Southwest. Look what's happened over the 10 years preceding the 2010 census. The blue here represents growth of minority populations that are more than double the national average. So 57% or more. And then the lighter blue there is 28 to 57%, greater than the double the rate of growth of the minority population. And the point here is that diversity is spreading all over the entire country. The growth of the population, and that is mostly immigrant population, but especially Hispanic populations that have spread everywhere. And I'm sure most of you know this already, including in New York State and in many parts of rural areas as well. And this is from a portrait of immigrants in New York by the Office of the New York State Comptroller, just talking about how decreased population hurts communities and how immigrants might help alleviate the economic and fiscal challenges of confronting many cities in upstate New York. The problem with upstate New York, if you regard it as a problem, is that it's primarily a white population. White natural decrease, white below replacement levels of fertility, white outmigration from rural schools and from inner city neighborhoods where they move to the suburban areas for better schools and so on. Most of the immigrant growth here is in the New York City metropolitan area. The statewide average of 22%, far below that in many parts of rural New York State. Here you can see immigrants as a proportion of the total population in some selected upstate cities. These are higher, obviously, than these various regions, but we're still talking about relatively small shares of growth. Some states, for example, have introduced policies to actually attract immigrants to their communities, and Iowa is a good case of this. Nebraska as well, but this isn't always popular among rural people who tend to exhibit much higher rates of anti-immigrant bias and so on. The third thing is deprivation, which all of you know about this from a firsthand experience. We're talking really here about concentrated poverty and growing spatial inequality, which has returned in this period of growing economic inequality, wealth inequality, income inequality in the United States over the past 20 years or so. This is what we see about poverty rates for the state overall. These are poverty rates from 2000 to 2018. You can see the upward tick, especially during the Great Recession of the late 2000s and then the subsequent decline. We've seen big decline. This is characteristic of a lot of states, and it's characteristic of the national scene as well. New York poverty rates are still slightly higher than the United States, but I think what's really interesting is the variation that you see within the state of New York, especially within some of the cities and the suburbs and in rural areas. And just to give you an example of this, I pulled out some recent estimates from the Census Bureau, some of the estimates based on the American Community Survey. These are New York poverty rates by place and county. So we can compare Syracuse and we compare it to the overall county growth, Rochester, Buffalo, Utica, and so on. You can see in Syracuse, about a third of the population is below the official government poverty line. We're talking here about roughly 20,000 for a family of four, say. But you can see the much lower rates for the county overall. And you see this same pattern in Rochester compared to Monroe, Buffalo compared to Erie, Utica compared to Oneida, and so on. And at the bottom in red there, I have the county seats along with some mostly rural counties. And you can see the very high rates, even in these rural places as opposed to the county overall. So the difference between the county and the place suggests that the rates outside of these cities, Syracuse, Rochester, and so on, are much lower. And of course, that reflects the suburbanization of the population, the more affluent populations, the populations that have moved there in response to better housing or to better schools and so on. So there's a big spatial disparity here, city-suburb, that is really quite large, even by national standards, I think. And these numbers in the cities have not changed very much over the last several decades. So to sum up here, I think this has many implications for housing in upstate New York and throughout the state and the nation for that matter. And I think New York faces historically difficult demographic challenges both now and into the future. And into the future, we're talking about continuing chronic outmigration, but we're also talking here about natural increase, or the lack of it, which in the past used to offset the declines associated with chronic outmigration. In-migration or out-migration was offset by an excess of births over deaths. That's no longer true any longer. That's no longer true today, in part because of declining fertilities, but also because, especially in upstate New York, which is a largely white population, we're talking about declines in the absolute size of the white female population and declines in fertility. So many parts of New York State are facing conditions that are have serious implications for housing, but a lot of other social services as well. Depopulation, deaths, diversity deprivation are all related to unmet need and demand for housing, for medical services, legal services, and so on. So thank you all very much. I hope this was useful. I'll be looking forward to the questions.